This era of NBA player movement was out of control. So let's regrade the biggest trades from 2010 to 2015. So we begin with 2010, which might not seem like a crazy movement year in terms of trades, but it kind of was because LeBron, Chris Bosh, Carlos Boozer, those guys changing teams were actually signing trades. But I decided not to count those and came up with a deal that actually swung a title. That's where we're starting here. Tyson Chandler going to the Dallas Mavericks in exchange for basically some expiring contracts. And the context around the situation is really interesting. Dallas was trying to get a big free agent in that offseason, a theme we've seen from them over the years. They were trying to get LeBron. They were trying to trade for Chris Paul at the time. And this Eric Dampier contract was a $13 million expiring that could just turn into nothing. They could just cut Eric Dampier, whoever had him, and save $13 million. And so they were using that contract to try and get a big name. And ultimately, they settled for Tyson Chandler. Now, the Bobcats at the time were basically just trying to get out of salary. In Dallas, this ends up winning them the 2011 title. Tyson Chandler makes an all-defense team that year, and he was unbelievable, specifically in the postseason. They do not beat that Heat team, despite all the weirdness of that series, without Tyson Chandler, without this trade. And so in hindsight, obviously, this has to be an A-plus deal for Dallas. There's no scenario in which you trade for a guy, you win a title, not necessarily solely because of him. Obviously, Dirk and that entire team was unbelievable, but Tyson Chandler was the perfect Rick Carlisle 5, and he was unbelievable for that team defensively in his role. And then for Charlotte, I almost said for the Hornets, for the Bobcats, I gave them a C- simply because it's not like Chandler was some incredible trade asset at the time. They didn't really do anything with the salary cap space that they created by moving the Dampier contract, but ultimately you can't grade them too harshly. It's not like Tyson Chandler was an all NBA level player at the time that they moved him. He was just in a perfect spot in Dallas. Now we move on to 2011, and this is a year that it gets weird. Everybody remembers 2010 and the crazy movement there with LeBron going to Miami and all those things. But 2011, at the deadline, we have Melo leaving Denver, going to New York. We have the Dwight saga. We have Darren Williams going to New Jersey. We have a lockout that summer. And then in December, Chris Paul gets traded. And what's even crazier is none of the things that I just talked about are the entry on this list, because in the 2011 draft, we have one of the biggest trades of the decade. Kawhi gets traded on draft night to San Antonio in exchange for George Hill. And everybody's heard the story at this point, right? San Antonio did not want to trade George Hill. They loved him as a player. He was good in Indiana. And they just decided that Kawhi was worth it. They saw this prospect they felt like everybody was sleeping on. They felt like they could fix his jump shot. And not only was he a part of title teams, but he kind of bridged the gap in San Antonio, brought them this new era, and then ultimately decided to leave San Antonio. But it's without a doubt bigger than the CP3 trade. It's bigger than the Melo trade. It's certainly bigger than the Darren Williams trade. And it's an unbelievable moment in NBA history. And one of two trades within that decade that Kawhi was a part of that are some of the biggest trades in the 2010s, which I talked about in the previous video as well. In terms of grades, again, if it leads to title or titles, it has to be an A+ for San Antonio. George Hill was good in Indiana. He was a nice player for them. I think ultimately he got moved for Jeff Teague, who ended up leaving free agency. So it didn't get them anything, further on down the road outside of that if you're Indiana. If you're San Antonio, it's an A+. For Indy, I gave them a C-. It would have been incredible for them to go from Paul George in the 2010 draft and then Kawhi in the 2011 draft, but ultimately they made the decision that they needed guard help. It was relatively defensible at the time, and who knows if Kawhi turns into Kawhi anywhere other than San Antonio, but it's an incredible what if to look back on. Not only Paul George and Kawhi, but Danny Granger was doing things shortly prior to that as well. An incredible what if for Indiana. And now we move on to 2012, and this is what I'm talking about when I say that this is just an insane era for player movement. In 2012, we have Steve Nash to the Lakers, Kyle Lowry to the Raptors, Joe Johnson to the Nets, the 4-team mega deal that's Dwight, Bynum, Iggy, and Vucevic that basically is the trade before the trade that starts the process, because Andrew Bynum flames out in Philadelphia. Dwight does basically nothing in LA and then leaves. Iggy ends up going to Golden State in the following offseason. Vucevic is an important piece for Orlando that they end up getting trade assets for down the road. But none of that is the trade that I picked for 2012. Because in that year, in October, which is one of the weirdest time trades of all time, the Rockets get James Harden. They get Harden in exchange for Kevin Martin, Jeremy Lamb, 2 firsts and a second. The 2 firsts became Steven Adams and Mitch McGary, and the second became Alex Abrinas. So essentially it's Harden for Kevin Martin, Jeremy Lamb, Steven Adams, Mitch McGary, and Alex Abrinas. Now, Martin was at least a minor contributor for a little bit. Same thing with Jeremy Lamb. Steven Adams was good for Oklahoma City for a long time, but it's one of the most lopsided trades of the last 15 years in the league. It's unbelievable what James Harden turned into in Houston. Even the most optimistic of people never would have expected James Harden to become an MVP candidate in Houston. He was clearly good. There were contract issues there. They didn't know if they wanted to pay him long term. And it's something that, we kind of gone over a lot, right? But even in any circumstance that they would have traded James Harden, they never would have thought that he would become an MVP candidate and one of the best offensive players of his generation in Houston, and now kind of what's happened on after that. For the grades, though, it can't be anything but an A+ times a million for Houston, because it's just so unbelievably uncommon to trade for an MVP level player for not giving up literally everything on your roster. And then for the Thunder, I gave them an F times a million as well, because there's just no way that, even if you don't expect Harden to become an MVP candidate, you have Russ, you have Kevin Durant, you have James Harden, you pay those three guys and you never let go. Because if they keep Harden, maybe they win a title or two, maybe KD stays, maybe they're all three still there in this exact moment. Who knows what Harden would have turned into, but at least at the time, he was okay coming off the bench. He was okay being the third guy. And in the modern era, in 2022, this would never happen. You would never trade James Harden. They all got along. Harden didn't have a great final series the year before, but you would just keep these three guys and say, we'll figure it out. And so it's unbelievable still that they made this move. And that, again, given everything else that happened in this year, that this is the biggest trade of that year. 2013 now, and this one is painful. I was scrolling through and I was looking at what the biggest deals were from this year. And I was like, oh, this one's interesting, that one's interesting. And then I came upon it and I was reminded of it again. It's the Nets Celtics trade. So basically in total, bear with me here, it is Paul Pierce, Kevin Garnett, Jason Terry, and a 2017 first and a second to the Nets for some players. A 2014 first, a 2016 first, a 2017 first, and a 2018 first. Some of those were picks or pick swaps. The picks, the 2017 first that went to Brooklyn became Kyle Kuzma. They used that pick to get D'Angelo Russell. The first round pick in 2014 for Boston became James Young. 2016, Jaylen Brown. 2017, Markelle Fultz, who Boston traded back with that pick to get Jason Tatum in that draft. And then 2018 is Colin Sexton. They used that pick to get Kyrie Irving. It is, in terms of grades, it's not even worth grading. It is the greatest trade, in my opinion, in NBA history, and the worst trade in NBA history on opposite sides. Even given the fact that Boston didn't end up using that 2018 pick, they used it to get Kyrie, who ends up leaving. Even given the fact that they missed on James Young, it is as much value, as much compensation as you can ever expect to get in exchange for a superstar level player, much less over-the-hill veteran guys like KG and Paul Pierce that, yes, meant a lot to Boston, but they weren't the same players certainly at that point. But Brooklyn didn't care. They thought these picks are going to be in the 20s. We're going to be, contending for the next couple of seasons. It's an incredible addition for us to be able to get these guys, in addition to having Darren Williams, Joe Johnson, and Brook Lopez. They look like legitimate title contenders, and they thought none of these picks matter. And obviously it cratered, and it's one of the most unbelievable stories in league history over the last 15 years that these picks became what they did, that Boston nailed two of them. Everything about what Boston has going for them right now, Jaylen Brown, Jason Tatum, and then at the time, Kyrie, came back to this trade. It's the biggest haul anyone's ever gotten for a player that is not an MVP level player. Like, it's incredibly unlikely that the Rockets end up getting more out of James Harden at his peak in that trade than Boston got in exchange for Kevin Garnett and Paul Pierce here, just because of how well the draft picks worked out. It's unbelievable. It'll probably never happen again. It's the craziest, most lopsided trade in NBA history. For 2014 now, we have the Andrew Wiggins, Kevin Love swap. This is a very interesting one to look back on because we've gone back and forth on it so many times. At the time, it felt like a win-win for both sides. Minnesota gets Andrew Wiggins. Kevin Love doesn't want to be there anymore. The Cavs want to bring in Kevin Love to help them compete for a title. LeBron basically asks them, hey, I want to keep Kyrie. I'm coming back. Let's move Wiggins, the first pick in the draft, in exchange for Kevin Love, and let's run it back. There's other players involved here, but essentially it boils down to Wiggins for Love. And at the time, Love, in the beginning, struggled to, or really for the entirety of his Cleveland tenure, really struggled to find his place outside of just being an off-ball spacer, had really good moments, and I kind of always defend Kevin Love for sacrificing a lot during those years in Cleveland. In the Minnesota, in the beginning, Andrew Wiggins was averaging 20 plus a game, looked like someone that was going to be a really good player, and then it cratered for Wiggins, and then the Love thing got weird once LeBron left, and now we're back at this point where Wiggins is an all-star starter, struggling now at the moment. Love is still on Cleveland after signing a big contract extension, and it's just gone every which way from the moment it happened. But again, if we're just going back to our rule, I think it's unlikely that Cleveland wins a title with Andrew Wiggins on the roster in those first couple of seasons that they did have Kevin Love. And so ultimately, I give them an A. Even though you can make the argument that if they could have developed him, Wiggins could have been a more valuable player to that play style where you have, LeBron at the 4 plus a 5-man, and then you have Wiggins and, Kyrie and all these other guys. You could have argued that from a play style standpoint, where LeBron was at in his career, it didn't make sense to trade for a 4/undersized 5, and that Wiggins would have been a better fit. I think a lot of people made that point at the time, but LeBron just didn't want to wait. He didn't want to wait around and ultimately get him a title. So I'm going to give them an A. And for the Timberwolves, I'm going to give them a B-, because even though the Wiggins thing kind of flamed out, they ultimately, move him for Andrew Wiggins for D'Angelo Russell, and they get something out of that. And Love didn't want to be there anymore. And the guy that he became in Cleveland was not representative of how dominant he was statistically in Minnesota, but in terms of compensation in exchange for a guy in Kevin Love that was a borderline All-NBA caliber player, but maybe didn't have a ton of trade value relative to what you would expect from that level of a player. Getting Wiggins, who a lot of people thought was an incredible draft prospect at the time, is defensible. I give them a B-. And in 2015, those of you that watched the other video know that I already covered 2015 once. I'm going to do it again just because I had to throw this trade in here. It's a trade that nobody talks about. It's unbelievable to look at now. The Bucks traded Norman Powell on a 2017 first to the Raptors in exchange for Greivis Vasquez. I'm going to put Greivis Vasquez's stats immediately prior to that trade up on screen here. I don't know why you would trade Norman Powell, who obviously turns into an interesting player, and a first in exchange for this. I don't have an explanation or any kind of context for that. That 2017 first becomes OG Anunoby. It's the most lopsided, craziest trade that nobody ever talks about. And it's not necessarily the biggest trade for 2015. I already covered that in a previous video. That was Goran Dragic going to Miami, but I kind of wanted to cover 2015 again, specifically so I could mention this. And yeah, that's the end of the video. Hope you guys enjoyed it. If you did, my name is Tucker. Leave a like rating down below, and I will see you all next time.